Hello everyone, this is You Multicultural on Civic platform. I'm Dujan.
And I'm Sana. Today, our topic is the fears and challenges of the Muslim community here in Winnipeg. Now, we are joined by Dr. Idris Al-Bakri. He is a father of 4 children and a longtime member of the community here in Winnipeg. He was also the previous chair of the Manitoba Islamic Association. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So our first question is, we know you are a longtime member of this community in Winnipeg, and especially you were heavily involved in the Muslim Winnipeg community. Our question is about what kind of challenges did you see the Muslims face early on?
Okay, thanks for the question. So I think just to qualify your question about long-time member of the community, I think it's relative. So there have been people here who have lived here longer than I have, significantly longer, and have made significant more contributions. And so just kind of want to qualify that a little bit. I have been in Winnipeg for 18 years, so not the longest time, but maybe long enough to be able to make some observations. So I think some of the challenges that we all go through is that we are still communities that are in the process of becoming established, in the sense that we are still building organizations, institutions. We are still growing through immigration, so we haven't sort of settled down, so to speak. That brings its own challenges. And we are still figuring out, or many of us are still figuring out what it means for them to be Muslims in Canada. So there's kind of a community building, organizational building component. There's an emotional component about what it means to be here, as well as the component of new members arriving and settling in the city and in the province, and that creates a dynamic that's sometimes quite challenging.
Are these challenges the same as you saw? You were very involved in university, in the Muslim associations in your universities. Are those still the same challenges that you saw then? Or have they evolved, or have they changed as you have, as the time has moved on?
So prior to moving to Winnipeg, I was living in the US, in America, and I was involved in my student community, as well as in just the community who was living in that town. And I think they're quite different. The US is a very unique community, because I think about close to half of the Muslim community are African Americans who have been in the US for centuries, right? They came here there through the slave trade. So you have an immigrant component, and then you have a more historically a historical community of Muslims who's been part of the American fabric for centuries. So that's a different dynamic that we don't have here. We're here primarily immigrant. Although I'll say this, is that I think when I was going to school in the 90s and the early 2000s in the US, and in many of those communities, the challenge was always about youth, and about creating or synthesizing back then American Muslim identity. I think some of these issues still are also, we have confront here. We're still talking about youth. I think we will always talk about youth and about how we encourage youth participation, and how we figure out ways to ensure that our young people who are growing up here remain true to Islam, and also how we figure out or synthesize the Canadian Muslim identity. I think these issues are always going to be confronting us. They're never going to go away.
So after you were in America and then you came to Winnipeg and you were a part of the community here, you also served as the chair of the Manitoba Islamic Association. So was there any sort of, through that unique lens, did you see any more challenges being sort of at the forefront almost of the Muslim community here?
I think locally speaking, one of the things we struggled with, and I think maybe struggle with until now, is a sense of isolation. We're 7 hours from Regina and 2 days from Toronto. So we're not close to other Muslim communities, right? So, and I think I found that people who were involved here or who lived here as Muslims sometimes were not aware of the broader, larger North American community and the issues that it was confronting, and what could be learned from what has already been done in other places. And I think one of the things that I was able to do was bring my experience in the U.S. and just just being aware of what's out there, some of the scholars or activists or whatnot, and some of the issues that have already kind of come across in my experience, and help make that connection. I think as, again, people continue to come here and arrive in the country and into Winnipeg, that's it, they're just Winnipeg. And it's sometimes a little bit harder for them to think that we're actually part of a broader national Canadian Muslim community, and even a North American Muslim community where there's a lot we can learn from the good stuff that has taken place in other places, but also learn from their mistakes.
Now, we're going to focus a little bit more on the future of the Muslim community. What are some fears coming from a community member yourself and also an active member of the MIA? What are some fears that you see the community here has for the future of the youth, of the children, and of the families here?
Okay. So I don't like the term fear. I don't think we should, maybe we should say challenges, because you can rise to the challenge. Fear, you just run away, right? Right. If there's fear, there's flight. Yeah. But if there's a challenge, you try to rise to the challenge. So in terms of, so you asked about families, and that's just one dimension of sort of what we need to think about and work on. I think that, again, going to the idea that many families are so new, and one of the things we did was a survey a couple of years ago, and I think about half or more than half of the people we talked to had been here less than 10 years, which is very, very recent. So being parents here is very different from being parents somewhere else. And I do think we have a parenting crisis. I don't think we have a youth crisis. I think we have a parenting crisis. If we solve the parenting issue, or if we are able to help and support parents in sort of figuring out how to be Canadian Muslim parents as opposed to be Arab Muslim parents or Pakistani Muslim parents or what have you, I think that would help move us along quite a bit. I think also a lot of us work. I mean, you said fear. I think it's so I'm going to come back to that parents, and by extension the community of parents, oftentimes deals with issues a little too late and from a position of panic. Oh, my kid doesn't pray. Oh, well. So I think we need to learn to deal with our issues proactively, and not to be intimidated by what happens or what we might see that we don't feel quite aligns with our values. I think panic is not a good place to work from, but proactively thinking through things to help our kids to deal with the things that they confront positively as opposed to just reacting to them negatively.
So what are some steps or some ways that people can proactively find and actively work to avoid or to move through those obstacles or challenges rather than just acting in panic?
Well, I think the best parenting advice I've ever heard, ever in my life, was that, and my wife always reminds me of it because I don't always, often I don't live up to it. I heard this piece of advice many years ago. Someone said, small sacrifices make great parents. And I think that parents have just to make choices. Where do you spend your time? Sometimes we are so much in pursuit of the lifestyle that we compromise the quality of life. And I understand that there are certain struggles that people go through where they have to work 2 jobs and there's very limited time to be at home. I get that, but you just have to first and foremost invest in a relationship with your family and with your children. I think there's been some studies that shown, and this is not unique to Muslims, they've shown across the board that one of the determinants of faith being sort of handed over or accepted by the younger generations is the warmth of the relationships that the kids have with their parents, especially the fathers, interestingly enough, not the mothers. The fathers more than the mothers, interestingly enough. I thought that was very counterintuitive. And so I think ultimately that's what it is. Parents have to be parents. And then from that point on, we can talk about, okay, so there's particular challenges and how do we deal with them, how do we respond to them, and so on.
You said earlier that we don't have a youth crisis, we have a parent crisis. But what do you think our youth should be doing, or what is the importance of their involvement in any community?
Okay. So I'll tell you this. I think if you look at I'm a student of the Prophet's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his community. Let's just talk about the community in Medina.
Mm-hmm.
It was a new community. You know, he immigrated. He fled to Medina. He was welcomed there. He had a refugee crisis to deal with, like the ones who came with him from Mecca. It was a community going through many struggles, poverty, military aggression. So, you know, if we think we have it difficult, if we think we're struggling, then just think about what they had to go through. So let me ask you this now: did the Prophet and his community have a youth group? He did not. So I think the idea should be that we don't really need to separate ourselves into youth and adults, or youth and older people, or men and women, or the seniors. I think we need to strive towards a much more integrated experience for our community, where people, regardless of age, now we have to acknowledge that there are differences that come with age, and that society as it is today sometimes forces us to segregate because, well, you guys spend so much time in school with people only of your age, as opposed to in more traditional societies, for example, how your grandparents might have grown up, as they grew up around their uncles and aunts and cousins and so on, and they were all just integrated. So I think we need to strive for a better integration. It's important to create an environment that is conducive to that, meaning that someone who's, you know, kind of old like me comes into a community space and can relate and can feel at ease, and someone who's much younger or very different in many ways can come and also still feel at ease and feel that the space belongs to them.
So you've been involved in the community for very long, and you've done a lot of change in the community, a lot of positive change. And what is, now that you're taking a step back from taking a lead role in the community, what are what's the vision that you have? And then what are some ways that we can, or the steps that you wish to be taken for us to accomplish those steps as youth and as a community that's going to, that are integrating together?
So let me just talk about stepping back. I think stepping back, regardless of any personal circumstances, is important. And we have to realize that the Prophet ﷺ died, and Islam survived and grew and thrived. And I think we come from cultures where we are used to people being in positions of authority or power or responsibility all their lives. And I think it's important to change that. So I encourage all of those who are in positions of leadership to think about that, whether you're an imam, think about a time where you say, okay, I've been around for 10 years leading this masjid, maybe it's time for me to do something else. If you are the leader of a nonprofit organization, one of the most important things to do is to create a succession plan, so that there's going to be a time, whether it's of your own choosing or not, when you're not around, and so creating these plans for people to replace us is very important. And I think people need just to step down, and let new blood. There might be a period of where things are not quite exactly where they should be, but I think we need to let that growth take place. And leaders who lead in positions of authority for 30, 40 years, I don't think it's a healthy thing to do. That's just my opinion. In terms of vision, here's what I'd like to see. I'd like us to imagine, let's just say, a young person called Jack. Okay, Jack. Jack wakes up one day and is hit by an existential crisis. What am I doing here? What's going to happen to me? What's the meaning of life? It's just going through a crisis of faith, right? Asking the questions that faith responds to. And Jack, on his street, or Jacqueline on her street, if it's a female, there's a church, there's a mosque, there's a synagogue, maybe there's a Hindu temple, maybe there's an indigenous lodge or something, and they want to go seek counsel, and they are as equally likely to choose to go to the mosque as they are to go to any other institution and ask those questions, because they feel the mosque is part of their community. They feel that the Muslim neighbors are part of their community. There's nothing weird or odd or different about a mosque being on their street. That should be the vision. And how do we get there? That's a different story. I'm not sure I have the answer for it. But so I dream of a community that maintains Islam as we've inherited it from the Prophet and from the companions and the subsequent generations of Muslims. It's authentic to the teachings, to the mainstream teachings, but is at peace and at ease with being part of the Canadian fabric, and conveys that and exhibits that to the surrounding community so that people feel comfortable engaging with us on a number of issues. One of the best things I've ever had said to me as someone who was leading the MIA was a colleague at work who's non-Muslim, telling me, oh, my son comes and plays basketball at the mosque. And that should be really the vision. The kids from the neighborhood can just walk in, shoot some hoops, and there's nothing weird about it. It's not like, oh, we're going to go hang out with these weird people. No, they're just our neighbors, and they have a community center, and we go and hang out there. And I think it's important to have that.
We wanted to ask, as this is kind of a current problem and something we see regularly, what is the role of youth in Islamophobia?
It's a very good question. So we did some research, and we found that 70% of the female respondents had said that they had experienced some form of Islamophobia, and many of the youth were saying that they're experiencing in school. And so, of course, first and foremost is whether we are young Muslims or older Muslims, we have to model the values of our faith and the character of our Prophet. Meaning that in school, at work, as a neighbor, at university, wherever we are, whatever field God has placed us in, whatever space God has put us in, we have to model the characteristics of Islam. Being kind, being gentle, being merciful, being understanding of people, and so on. This is probably one of the most effective ways in which we can respond to Islamophobia, is just to disarm people who have negative notions just through our character. Many years ago I learned of a study in the US where the people who had the most favorable views of Muslims were graduate students. Well, why was that? Because they had graduate Muslim student colleagues. So they knew someone, obviously universities have a higher percentage of Muslims because there are many Muslims who went to the US for studies. So people get to know you. That can change things in many ways, and so I think we should never underestimate the impact that we have on our friends, on our peers, on our colleagues, whether negative or positive. And everybody, whether we like it or not, we have to carry the burden of being ambassadors for our community and our faith. In terms of Islamophobia, I want to just. It's going to be there, right? It's there. But I would say, and especially to young women who carry their faith on their head, so to speak, is don't let it define you, okay? We live in a culture where, you know, people sort of use these things and they get in a state of mind where they're always taking on the victim's role. Okay, so you know, you Sana or you Dijan may have heard comments in school about hijab or this or that, right? Do you have hair or things like that? And you know, these are sometimes are just innocent comments and sometimes they're mean. But is that going to be the defining experience of your life? I think we need to confront it. I think we need to deal with it. I think we need to build relationships and educate people and call out racism wherever it exists, strongly, unequivocally, but individually and as a community, we should not get stuck in a mentality of, oh, we're the victims of Islamophobia. God has endowed us with the ability to define our own faith, our own future, and our own destiny, so to speak. And we have some back-breaking work ahead of us in community building, in youth empowerment, in integrating men and women and young and families and singles and elderly and so on. And I think Islamophobia is important, but in some ways, we should not let it become our distraction. There needs to be those who work on it, specialize in it, deal with it, respond to it, support us when we have are dealing with it, but it shouldn't take up all of our airspace, so to speak. That was all we talk about, all we think about is Islamophobia. A young woman like yourselves should not walk in the street thinking about, okay, when is going to be the next Islamophobic comment or incident. That should not define her outlook on her future and life. No, her outlook should be, I'm going to become a doctor, I'm going to become a psychologist, I'm going to be doing this, I'm going to be raising my children, I'm going to have a family, and so on. We'll deal with Islamophobia, but it shouldn't be the defining issue that our community works on.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This was an insightful conversation, which I'm sure we both learned a lot from. We hope you liked this episode, and if you did, please leave a like and subscribe to Multicultural channel.